All right, good afternoon, everybody. So, welcome to this panel, and I'm really excited for this because it's a power packed panel, and we are supposed to be discussing. I say supposed to be sustainable systems and what does it mean to build whole communities, right? So there's a lot in that title, right? And sustainability now is the buzzword, right? And building wholeness or whole communities, that's another buzz phrase. And you see a lot of corporations, whether they are well intentioned or otherwise, they will use these buzzwords, right? And we all sort of know what they mean, but not really as well. So let's discuss that today, right? What does it mean in the first place to build? What is a sustainable system, right? Perhaps more importantly, what is a whole community, right? And today, I think we have practitioners, so not just academics and people who theorize but don't do anything else, like myself. But these are people who are actually doing things on the ground, right? And I will introduce them as I ask the questions to them. So let's begin with the OG, right? So with Xiaoyun, and she is of course the a former nominated member of parliament, right? And also the head of Common Ground, and she's been in this sphere for the longest time, and she has a lot of experience. And I really wanted to ask her first, because she is a practitioner, not just because Common Ground is her turf, but she has also that parliamentary experience, which does give a different dimension to your. I don't know. I'm speaking for her, but does give a different dimension to your perspectives, right? And I don't know whether that experience was transformative for you, Shell. But I wanted to ask you first, what does wholeness mean to you, and what is a whole community?
But there's so much there, Walid. So much that you loaded in there. Okay, so I'm not an academic that has studied this, but I can tell you the definition of wholeness that means something to me. Whoa, okay. By the way, I have to warn you that my cat does not want to be thrown out of the room, so he'll make a guest appearance. Okay, what is wholeness? I think about the opposite of what wholeness means while I try and throw my cat off my table. Wholeness, to me, the opposite is fragmentation, division, brokenness. So to me, wholeness is this state that we kind of wish we were. We all have this like idea of like if only things weren't broken, if only things weren't fragmented, if only we could be whole and well and healthy. Yeah, but what it means academically, it's so different. But I look at it as this oppositeness. We don't want things to be the way that they are. Yeah. So what does it mean to be well again? So that's what whole means to me. And if I think about whole communities, uh, community again, multiple definitions out there. A definition that is quite simple but has worked well for me is a community is a group of people that share a mutual concern for each other. And I think it's hard to be mutually concerned with other people if, well, first of all, you are still broken and fragmented inside yourself. So you can't even like be concerned about yourself, or you don't even know what to be concerned about yourself. So how can you even begin to project a concern for someone else? Yeah. So to me, you have to support the wholeness of the person so that they can be interested in the whole of another person. That's my long response to your question.
Oh, no, no, that was pretty succinct, I think. And thank you for that. So I wanted to ask Basil, who is of course involved with Being Bridges, is an interfaith organization, and he does. I mean, as the term literally tells us, he does try to build, or not build, maybe try to be the bridge between communities, especially faith communities, right? So, Basil, do you have anything to add on to that? What Shell said about wholeness, and I wanted to get back to Shell after we get to everyone as well, and maybe Basil, you have a comment on this. So Shell seems to suggest that building yourself is a prerequisite before you can start thinking about building a community.
Mhm.
It's almost very similar to what Jordan Peterson says, right? On this particular matter. So, do you agree? So does that mean that we all have to work on ourselves first? And where when do we stop working on ourselves? Not we never stop working on ourselves, but when do we reach the point where we say, oh, we are ready enough to build a whole community?
Wow, great question, Walid. Thank you. Yeah, and very good connection that you made with our name as well, with being bridges. I did not think of it that way, but the way you connected it to Xiaoyan's answer was brilliant. And I say it makes a lot of sense to why we chose this name as well, because I work in the field of diversity, right? We do both interreligious as well as interracial dialogue and harmony. And in that field, there's a very popular term when people talk about building bridges, right? And our sense is like, before we can even build those bridges, how about one step more basic, right? Being those bridges ourselves. So I definitely believe in that idea of, hey, we ourselves, should be in that process of moving towards wholeness before we can reach out. But I want to point out, I don't mean that you have to be perfect before you can help others. I believe there's a dynamic here, right? The way I liken this is, I call this my Lisa Simpson theory of change, right? From the Simpsons, right? There was this episode where the Simpsons, the family, right? They had gone through poverty and they lost all their money. And then the mother, Marge Simpson, said, "It's okay, maybe I can learn piano," right? And then Lisa Simpson says, "But mom, you don't know how to play the piano." Right. And then Marge Simpson, the mother, said, "Well, maybe I can take lessons. If I take lessons this week, right, I can teach those lessons to other people. And then next week, I take some more lessons. I teach those lessons to others." So actually, no, not Lisa Simpson, but Marge Simpson's theory of growth and change, right? So we grow. As we grow, we are learning new stuff. We are moving closer towards wholesomeness. And with that wholesomeness, we get to maybe ooze out of our pores some of those learnings to the rest of the community. Yeah, so being bridges. Thank you, Walid.
Right. Thank you, Basil. Thanks. So I wanted to ask Kai Sing's thoughts on this, right? Because he is involved with Studio Dojo, right? And that is about building digital systems, right? So do you see, Kai Sing, what are your thoughts on sustainable systems and whole communities, right? Is there a difference between building a digital community and a non-digital community?
Um, I think that's a good question. I don't think so. I would say the fundamentals are still the same. And yeah, I think I agree with Basil that it's not about being perfect. I think part of it is like seeing the brokenness as part of our whole. Like, can we see that we are all not perfect and we're all aspiring?
Right.
Um, and I think actually what I see in digital systems or digital communities maybe is there is a want to help and reach out and connect with very different people from across the world, and that's what digital does really well for us, right? And that there's a sense of we are not connected by geography but by interest and by heart and by passion. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. And sometimes maybe for some people, helping others is a way of then realizing, oh, maybe I'm not so whole, and then I can work on myself. So I do feel like it's a kind of
Right.
a hand over hand and iterative kind of cycle.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Kai Sing. I mean, that was really useful. I also wanted to say, I think Basil sort of revealed his age by making a Simpsons reference. Uh, our age. Okay, so let's get to somebody younger than all of us, right? So, Ping, what are
Oh my
your
God, when did
thoughts?
Simpsons become like too old? That's terrible, Wallet. Okay.
So, what Kai Sing said just now, right? Really, I mean, it struck a chord with me, right? Like seeing the brokenness as part of the whole, right? Uh, when do you know that you are not you have mended enough brokenness to actually start building communities. When did that realization come to you? Or has it ever
Um,
come to you, or you think let's just work on both at the same time?
yeah, I think it's a constant work in progress of working on both at the same time. And I was just thinking about, Sharon's answer and also Kai Sing's answer, and of course Basil's as well, about the definition of whole, and just wondering now if there's a community that is not whole by definition, because when Shell said that, it's about having that wanting to care, mutual affection or care for the other person within your community, and that sort of defines a whole community. It's hard to find a community that doesn't have that, right? Like that is by definition why a community exists. So I
Right,
feel that you know i- if everyone is whole, then you don't need a community,
right,
right?
right,
You
right.
don't need that the idea of looking out for each other, and exactly that you need some degree of brokenness in a space. um, and I also feel like no matter where you are, there's always something to be improved upon. And even if you start with like a tiny community and you manage to so-called resolve whatever cause or issue that you're working for, that that that's kind of like good sourdough starter, right? Like you can always bring in more people to to contribute to that, bring them to that same sort of space and knowledge, and then work on other causes or work on other issues, right? It's essentially an enlarging of that community. So I think there's always space to sort of tweak it and work on it. And I really liked how you made the connection with being bridges, and bridging, the idea of bridging, because when Continentalist was first founded, our first slogan was mapping stories, bridging gaps. And even now, one of our sort of goals is to bridge the gap between research and the public, because we find that in conversations that people have, especially today in a space that's very saturated, by noise in the social media space and the digital space, we find that it's very important that we come in with fact-based and data-backed sort of facts and findings. I mean, now we live in an age where there's something called alternative facts and fake news, right? So I think it's very important to have that common ground to even start a conversation. Otherwise, you're kind of always talking at two ends of the spectrum, and that's kind of why Continentalists exist and how we try to get train organizations to also do that, so that they can bridge that gap with the public. Yeah.
Right. So Peng is of course the co-founder of Continentalist, right? So it's another well, it tries to be a whole community as well, telling data-driven stories about Asia, right? And almost as if it's oxymoronic, right? That mission, right? Data-driven than stories, because people usually put these two, and I mean, I'm sure you guys did that purposely, right? But people always think of these two as very different, right? And I wanted to get to that storytelling part about narrative. So I'll get to it later, right? So we've discussed that. Hopefully it's enough in terms of understanding what whole communities mean, right? And Paying said something, is everyone is a whole, then we don't need a community, right? I think that's a pretty powerful line. So communities are essentially about sense of belonging. Is it fair for me to say that, Kai Seng?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And
Mm.
I think I personally struggle with a sense of belonging. In my own personal journey, I think I feel never fully settled, anywhere I go with anybody, even with family. I hope they don't see this, but but I
This
think,
is recorded, by the way.
yeah, I know. But I think there's always that search for some kind of connection,
Mm.
and actually that has really driven my, yeah, that search for a different type of community. So I'm traversing many different communities.
Right.
In the previous workshop that I ran, I was traversing the K-pop community and exploring that. So I think that sense of
Mm.
something missing really is giving me a really wonderful journey to different communities to see what's happening. So I'm
Mm.
really appreciating that, and I think that's part of like seeing the brokenness,
Yeah.
and that allows for something new to unfold. Yeah.
Right. So thank you. So And I think that ties in nicely with what I wanted to ask Basil as well. So the idea of building whole communities, you want to be, and especially for your work, Basil, you want to be as inclusive as possible, right? But the very definition of a community, even though we do not talk about communities in this particular way, but I think at least a subtext or the definition is, you, even if you try to be as inclusive as possible, then you would be excluding some people, right? Some people wouldn't be part of the community, right? So when we think of communities as outlets for sense of belonging, right? So there would be an exclusionary nature to some extent. Would you agree with that, Basil? And how would people who are interested in building these communities deal with that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think the nature of communities will include some form of in-group versus out-group, right? So the way I deal with that is I focus on two things, versatility and for lack of a better term, like dynamism or equilibrium, right? With versatility, right, it's an acknowledgement that, hey, our communities, even internally, will contain a lot of diversity, a lot of differences. And I think that may strike close to the heart of today's panel, right, today's issue, the idea of sustainable communities, right? Because the most difficult challenge in a community is essentially difference, right? How do we deal with difference? And then when we are different from each other, that's where conflicts start, that's where disagreements and people want to leave, right? So my sense is not so much about, hey, let's unify things, let's make things as united as possible, as same or as standardized as possible, but really focus on building up the versatility of that diversity, right? One of our taglines is creating a versatile diversity, right? Let's accept that diversity is our default. It's where we start off, right? That we can't even see that as a problem. We see that as the nature of things, but then how do we engage with that diversity? Just a short plug, like right now, a product that we are about to launch in about 1 or 2 months' time is actually a card game facilitating conversations about diversity. And we've actually named it diversity by default because of this very reason, right? That we are diverse, that diversity is not a fault. It is our default, right? So that's one point, the versatility of that. But the second point I want to bring up is this idea of having that dynamic quality, that it's okay to be in the out group, right? You can be in the in group, you can be in the out group, both provide you a sense of identity. And we've got enough communities out here, you know, in society, right, for this to happen, right? That's why there's that sense of equilibrium that we can move in and out. And I might liken this just as a simple metaphor, right? In the old days, right, when we were using email, before Gmail came about, right, a lot of your emails, if you wanted to save them and categorize them, it operated just like your file explorer on your computer. You take the email and you slot them into folders, right? This folder is for personal stuff, this folder is for work, this folder is for hobbies, another one for finances. When Gmail came along, it did something really interesting. Instead of folders, they started relying on tags, right? A tagging system. So if I have this particular email, I can tag this as work related, but also finance related. So suddenly that email, right, can fit into 3 or 4 classifications, right, depending on what it's connected to. So how about us as human beings in communities, in society, right, in the world, that we don't have to just align ourselves with one particular community? What if communities are like our tags? You know, I love drinking tea, right? Chinese pu'er tea, Japanese sencha tea. So I'm like a tea drinker, right? And that's like a strong feature of my life, I believe, right? So I tag myself as a tea drinker. I work as diversity, another tag. I have a mental health, I have a neurodiversity issue, right? So I tag myself there. So it doesn't mean just because I work in this field, I cannot maybe tap into mental health health and neurodiversity, because that's also my passion, because it's a personal suffering. And I may not spend a lot of time in that community, but I can tag myself as being aligned to their values, and hence my identity is connected to them. So that sense of equilibrium and moving in and out, that dynamic quality.
Kai,
Wow.
you wanted to add
Yeah,
something?
yeah. Hey, Basil, and that's a really great point, Basil. And we've been working on an interfaith landscape mapping kind of project together, right, these past few months. And I think that the idea of dynamism as well is coming in. I guess the results aren't out yet, but I think we had a really nice discussion about even if you are not in the in group, even as an out group, you can also create your own community. And actually, maybe that's how communities get formed and get diversity in that sense. I don't know
Yes,
whether you
and
want to
how
speak
they
a little bit into
flourish
that.
and grow, right?
Yeah, and then get accepted once they, as they grow bigger, the voice gets stronger, and then they go, okay, yeah, that's an interesting thing to then consider and work with.
Very good point. Thank you, Kasim.
So many quotable quotes.
Yeah, there are.
Basil said diversity is not a fault, is the default, right? And I really like the idea of thinking about communities and whole communities as not the same, which I think tends to be a fault of many, but it comes from a good place. It's the fault of many interfaith works, I feel. Like they will get different religions and we all talk about what is same amongst all the religions, right? Or even, and we try to minimize our differences, right? So I'm going to say, I don't think it's super sensitive, but it is. If it is, I mean, you guys can just cut this later from the recording. So for instance, and I think this is building on what Basil said earlier, right? The dynamism and the focus of building a community should not be about pretending we are all the same, right? So I am a Muslim and Shao is a Christian, right? And Muslims and Christians have certain theological positions on Jesus. And the Muslim and Christian cannot both be right on some things about Jesus, right? So it's either Jesus is God or he's not God, right? So the Muslim and Christian cannot be both right at the same time. They can both be wrong, right? And maybe Jesus didn't exist, or he's neither a prophet, he's not a prophet at all. So they can both be wrong, but they cannot both be right. And if we pretend in trying to build a community that we are the same, right, we are actually overlooking a lot of differences. And in the long run, we may hurt ourselves in the process of unifying. And maybe we should understand that the basis of building that community is we respect each other's rights to believe whatever you want to believe. Not that we respect each other's beliefs, because by default, if Shao is not a Muslim, she doesn't agree with the Muslim belief, right? So I cannot expect her to respect the belief that she doesn't believe in. It doesn't make sense, right? I do expect her to respect my right to believe in whatever. And I think that is a stronger sense of the stronger binding force which will build whole communities. Shao, you wanted to say anything?
Yeah, no, I'm resonating so much with what Basil shared. And then I'm also like, oh, Walid like saying my name so many times, I must like respond. but it all comes together, right? So I mean, so I'm gonna tap on what opened up for me when I listened to Basil, right? Because I'm hearing like, sometimes I think in our culture, in particular in Singapore, right, like there's an overemphasis on unity and harmony, as if it is the one and only thing to fight for, right? And that's good as long as it's not this oppressive or dishonest unity and harmony, the kind where let's just be harmonious in this family and not talk about the things that we actually should talk about, right? So I feel that if we want to be whole, and if we want to form community, we have to paradoxically appreciate that we all have boundaries. And the boundaries are what makes us different. They define you, they define me, and boundaries by definition exclude, right? It's like when I think of like two circles, two very strong boundaries, right? Even if I draw a Venn diagram, right? Sometimes we are in the center of that Venn diagram where we intersect. We have commonality, with unity, with harmony with each other, but you must also give me that space to differentiate myself, to say like, and there are all these other parts of me that are not in that space of merger. We are different. And you paradoxically cannot have true harmony if you don't allow people to differentiate themselves. Like, if we want true integration, you have to allow for differentiation. I have to be allowed to be different. I have to be allowed to say, I don't necessarily believe in what you just said. And will you still accept me? Will you still respect me? Will you still love me even? And if you don't, then I'm not sure what we're in this for. Yeah.
Right. So thank you. So another quotable quote, right? So you cannot have true harmony without differentiation. And then you introduce another big term, right? Big concept, right? You said that love is ultimately that's the basis of building whole communities, Shao?
I so my I think the hypothesis that I'm working on for I think the next few years is it's not just about love, but it's about power. And if we want to build whole communities, we actually need to teach ourselves and teach each other, what does it mean to love? And what does it mean to have power? And what does it mean to love others? And what does it mean to give power to others? And I think if we don't come to a personal understanding of what these two things mean for us, we can never balance it. Like, if you love people, but don't step into your power or don't own your power to be different and all that kind of stuff, or to set down boundaries, right? Then your love is a bit sentimental, very anemic like that. Your love like go nowhere one, right? Very sweet but powerless, right? So you do need to balance that power. But if you have a lot of power and you're like, I'm going to tell you exactly what I think about you, right? Like, screw this love thing, then you're not going to go very far. You can destroy your way through harmony, I will
Right.
smack you down,
Right.
but
Right.
you need that balance. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I guess that's a lesson for leaders of organizations, right? All of you are leaders in your organizations, right? How do you balance power and love, right? I mean, that's a huge one.
Mhm.
Paying, since you have some experience in this, right? Is it better to build communities using existing institutions that we have? And what's the advantage of that? Or is it better to, I mean, just start something new, right? So what, I mean, you chose the latter, but obviously, of course, you still, I mean, yours is not a rogue organization or anything, so you still work within the larger system, right? As everybody else. So, but why the latter path? Why not join an organization, right? What was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, I think I mean, this is backtracking a little bit to the creation of Continentalist. And
Sure.
when we founded this company, I think what we find in the news space specifically was a lot of, when we talk about Asia, we find that it's quite problematic, the color that
Mhm.
has been given to Asia. When it's in the news, it's always like, oh, there's some natural disaster going on, or some, dictatorship, or corrupt governments, corrupt systems. And even when it's good, Asia is kind of exoticized, right? It's a society steeped in tradition. If it's making references to Japanese society, then it's about how weird and eccentric Japan is as a society, or exotic travel destinations in Indonesia and whatnot. And we find that lens, it's problematic, right? Because it doesn't try to include Asia as like, we are one and the same, and we have, again, similar traits, similar desires, similar problems. And that's where we started, and we really wanted to provide that voice and the space to do that. And in that process of figuring out what we can do, we tried to find a way to sort of, maybe we can do a thing where we can synthesize common facts and grounds to let people explore this for themselves. And we realized that a lot of information out there is very hard to access, because even when people are very saturated, or not, I wouldn't say saturated, but after some time, if you've been an activist in your own community or in your own sector, for quite some time, like a few years or even 10 years, you forget that the language you speak can be exclusionary, because
Mm,
people outside of your sector doesn't understand the terms that you're using, they don't understand the definitions that you're referencing. And if and all human beings are like this. If we walk to the room and we feel a bit excluded, there's no desire. It takes a lot of courage to go up and say, hey, I want to know this space better and I want to be part of this space. But if that space is automatically more welcoming, then the barrier to entry is a lot lower, and that's what we seek to do, right? We try to open up the space that these causes work in, and say, hey, you can actually bring more people into this conversation if you just simply do a bit more work to tell a story around it, right? And we find that storytelling is obviously the easiest step to take, right? Awareness building is always the easiest step to take. If you do that first step, then it makes room for all of these other subsequent steps to come. And for us, because we decided to not focus so much on one issue, but to hone our skill set to facilitate many conversations to happen at the same time, so that's how we sort of created Continentalist. And yeah, so I think it's
Right.
when you say it's do we work with existing systems? Yeah, we do. And why we chose to set up our own, that's kind of the reason why. And I said, I think a lot of institutions and also causes, they after a while it's kind of like cyclical, the issues that they
Yeah.
face in. And yeah, and I think sometimes it takes a an external force,
Right.
or external a fresh
Disruption.
set of eyes to
Right.
sort of
Right. Right.
provide clarity to the problem. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I enjoyed listening to the genesis of Continentalist. And I mean, you also use the term activist, which I wanna go there in a while as well. I wanna go where Shao went as well, the balance between love and power, right? But before that, I wanted to talk about the power of narratives, right? And I think all of you use narratives in your respective work, right? So, uh, uh, Paying just mentioned using narratives and the utility of using narratives, right? Uh, at the same time, there are also you need to build narratives, but you have to dismantle narratives as well, right? So what is the process behind that? What is the process behind choosing which narratives to propagate or to propound? Which are the narratives you should dismantle in your own respective works? Or is there such a thing that you guys have gone through, like, oh, this is the narrative that I wanted to dismantle with the end of building a whole community? Kai Sing?
Wow. That's interesting because during lunch, this is inspired by lunch, I saw, so I was at a kopitiam, and on the table there was a HPV sticker. I don't know if you noticed those when you go to kopitiam, sometimes they stick a sticker, and it was, I'll read this out. To fight viral infections, you need time, not antibiotics. And it's antibiotics in red.
Wow.
It's quite a fascinating one because it then says antibiotics can't help you recover faster. They do not fight viruses such as flu or COVID. And that's like that's an example of people maybe having a very common understanding around what it means, or maybe I
Right,
take medicine, then I'll be better,
right, right,
but
right,
not truly understanding how that works in terms of actual data or science.
right, right,
And then them trying to, over a meal, try and slowly, subtly dismantle that.
right,
And it's not like in your face kind of
right.
a power move, right? Like, don't
Mm.
do this. But it's a, hey, have you considered that you actually need time, not medicine? I think that's a really subtle and yet a skillful way to consider dismantling. I guess dismantle has a certain, at least
Yeah,
to me, violent connotation.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And then maybe it's a melting, I would say,
Oh,
to
okay, nice,
consider.
nice.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So is that always the best approach? Because to melt a narrative, I mean, the presupposition is it's already there, it's already prevalent, to some extent at least, and therefore the softer approach always works better. Kai Sing?
I think that's where my own work is. I think I do lean more to the love than the power side. So that I think reveals my own preference. I do think there is a space for harder dismantling. I do think so. I think especially when the suffering is high, or the time criticality is there, it is important to sometimes act fast lah. And I think that's important as well. So I think there's a time and space for both. Yeah.
Shao, where do you lean If guys lean
Uh,
towards love, where do you lean to?
I think if I go by childhood preference, it would be more on the let's stay under the radar and love people. But actually, frankly, ever since I've been in Parliament, I have very, very much realized you need power. You have to balance it out. And it's okay. So I got to give you some context because in my line of work, so I am a trained professional coach, facilitator, intervener, dialogue designer, all of this stuff, right? And what that basically means is my job is to look at the words and hear the words that are coming out of people and to sort of figure out where's the interception point. And it is a skill set that can be dangerous. And sometimes the power move is also the more loving move because you make it obvious. I'm not manipulating you here. I'm
Right,
just stating it out
right,
plainly, right? So I'm not, so I don't see it from this soft or hard thing, but like how clear are
right.
you with the person that that's what you're doing? Um, when I think of like moments where I have to work with shifting narratives, I think of when I'm coaching people or intervening in a room or facilitating a dangerous conversation. And coaches, facilitators, therapists, all that, we are held by a very strong code of ethics that because of the work that you're doing, and it's almost like doing inception work like that, you must be very clear that you are not going in there to change someone's narrative. You can't do that. That is manipulation. You got to present the narrative and ask the person, would they like to accept it? Yeah, and that's the difference for me. However, like when I think back of my time in Parliament, I think the difference between how I look at parliamentary speeches versus, let's say, someone who's not in this field, right? I saw every parliamentary speech that I wrote as intervention work. That means, are there any key narratives about, let's say, an issue around like single mothers or whatever that I think the narrative deserves to be looked at? I'm not going to force feed anyone of it, but I will present an alternative narrative that I think is worth looking at. Yeah. And I think you have to be quite plain about it. Yeah.
Right. So that's really interesting. And I mean, I'm a political scientist as well. So obviously I lean towards power as well, right? But there is a danger in that, and that is the thing that I wanted to get to for the activist part, right? You know, if you are involved in the activist circles, and I think all of you are activists to some I mean, you all are activists. Maybe you may not like the term, or some of you do not refer to yourself as that. But I consider you, all of you, as activists, right? And I see that in the activist circles, um, there is this danger, there is this danger where we start self-aggrandizing ourselves, right? And start thinking that we are more important than we actually are. I mean, it's a selection bias because to be an activist, you have to be bold enough in some way to do things that others do not, right? But that boldness is what then leads you to think, oh, if I don't do this, who else would do this, right? And then you start thinking, oh, you're so important, right? And I think like this almost every day, right? And then I have to immediately check myself. Oh no, you're not that important. Like if tomorrow you went away, like the world would move on, or nobody would notice, but a few people. So how? And I think that there is a danger in trying to focus too much on power, right? In trying to change the world, or in the process of trying to change the world, right? We can lose our own souls as well, right? So I wanted to ask all four of you, actually, starting with Basil and Ping, have you guys gone through such existential questions in your own field of work, or is it just me? Yeah, maybe this is a problem that I think too highly of myself. Or but I do see that there are this seems to be, if I can call it, a disease amongst activists, and it can really impede our work, right? Because we start thinking that the implication is we start thinking we are too important, we are start thinking we are always right, and so on and so on.
Okay, thanks, Walid. I'll answer in two parts. One is a bit more directly connected to my work. The other one is about current affairs, what's going on in the world right now. With my work, it's really interesting. And I think this comes down to personality, right? Myself, like, I feel as though I do not have any activist bone in my body. I'm so like unmotivated to being an activist and going out there and fighting for my cause, right? And I do believe that interfaith dialogue is my cause, as well as, a sense of like humanity and spirituality, just for lack of a better term, I'll connect it with today, like that sense of community worldwide, that sense of inner peace, that sense of flourishing as humanity. But for some reason, I'm not the kind of person who's inspired even by my own cause, right? I'm really inspired by innovation. I'm really inspired by ideas, creativity, which is why, like when I'm talking to my team, like I keep reminding people, right? We are not about community activism. We are about community activation, right? About how to activate the community and thinking of unique, interesting ways of doing it. So I have to admit, even as a founder of an organization, my motivation, my energy seems to come with coming up with some interesting idea that nobody's ever thought of in terms of how to do that particular sectarian work, so that one is just about personality and how to activate the community, right? So community activators, right? But from that perspective. The second thing I might bring up is, I think a lot of us know about, what's going on in the world right now with the Ukraine situation and Russia. And I just came across this while reading Reddit last night, right? All of these up-to-the-minute news pieces, right? And I saw this little video on Twitter, like Reddit was connecting to Twitter, that the president of Ukraine made, right? It was in the middle of the night and he was there with his phone and he had a group of people around him from the rest of the government. And he was saying, I am here.
Yeah.
We will be protecting Ukraine. We are not going anywhere. We are not leaving, right? And the prime minister is here, the finance minister, or the minister of the interior, or like different people that he was naming. You see this group behind him, right? I connect this to that sense of love and even sacrifice, right? And here I might propose the idea that it may not be the opposite of power, that love is a form of power. And despite its exterior look of being very, very soft, it goes very deep. And because it goes so deep, it is very powerful, right? Very powerful. And sacrifice is one of those, most powerful forms of love, of expressing that love. When I watched that video as a Singaporean, right, watching the president, the leader of a foreign country, I was inspired. I felt like, oh my goodness, what can I do to help in this situation in Ukraine? When I woke up this morning, I even went to check his Twitter again. And this time I see him in the early mornings walking around his city, and saying, our people have done a really great job. But he stayed. He gave that sacrifice out of love. And I'd say that guy has gained a lot of power. I read a little comment where one of his citizens was saying, I actually didn't vote for this president. I voted for the other guy. But right now I'm so impressed and so connected to him. I'm willing to stay and fight for him. That guy is my leader. I just thought that was very powerful.
Yeah, and I really urge everyone to take a look at the speech that Basil just talked about. I really thought it was a powerful speech, and especially knowing where his background, he was a comedian who became the leader of Ukraine, and it was really moving. I thought, right, and when you said sacrifice is the manifestation of that love. So you're preaching to the congregation, with Indian parents, like they never never show love other than through sacrifice. But that's enough of a love language for me, right? As their children. Yeah. So Ping, you have any thoughts on this?
Wow, I mean, it's hard to follow after what Basil shared, but I just wanted to address immediately what he said about this speech, because again, everyone's talking about what's going on in Ukraine. And yesterday, with my team, we had our sort of what we call Lepak Friday. So at the last Friday of every month, we hang out and play games, and we also chit chat. And somebody asked the question of, if Singapore were to go to war, would you stay and fight, right? And it was quite a interesting question to see like people's difference of opinion. And for me it was like of course I'll stay and fight, right? And like, there's no question about it, right? Even if I'm not skilled in it, maybe I'll like stand in my window and throw Molotov cocktails at the enemy, right? um but there were some people who was kind of hesitant, but then when we kind of drilled down to the why, what sets you and me apart in wanting to stay and fight. And then one of my colleagues said a very beautiful thing, and she said, well, you stay and fight because your loved ones are here, right? And I think that's very important, because that's essentially the definition of a community, right? Because you love something that is near you, your friends and your family, and presumably that extends to a love of your like who your family loves as well, right? If they and I think in Mandarin we have this term, this idiom called IUTU, which is if you love the person, you love what they love too. And and that's kind of
Right.
how you begin a community, and that's what motivates you to fight for your country, be an activist, etc. um Coming back to when the question you had about if I identify as an activist, and these sort of existential questions, I think I'm very similar to Basil, that I don't exactly, especially in terms of the work that we do at data storytelling, I don't really see myself as an activist, but more as a facilitator, right? So I help activists find a way to tell the narratives, and I don't think it's necessarily exclusionary. And one of the things that we really value in content lists is diversity. And we don't mean diversity as I feel like in America, especially, sometimes when conversations around diversity becomes a list of check boxes that you tick,
Agreed.
right? Yeah,
Agreed.
like if you have this
Yeah,
minority
yeah,
profile
absolutely.
organization, you
I
take,
agree.
yeah, exactly. But it's actually a process, right? And it's a consensus building process. It's about listening to the differences, listening to what makes you and I a little different in our identities, in our worldviews, and trying to, and again, going back again to what Kaisen said about that HPB, advertisement or slogan or whatever poster. It's about taking time. And I think as Singaporeans, we're always very ganjiang. We want to like find the solution fast and like hasten the process and move efficiently, right? And we find consensus building very inefficient, because it's like, oh, we have to sit there and listen to everybody's opinions. And if you take all the time and listen to everybody's opinions, then nothing can ever get done. There's always this, again, narrative that's painted around consensus building. But I think that taking the time is a beautiful thing, because you listen genuinely to people's differences and you try and bring them into the fold. And in Conti, when we tell our stories, that's what we also aim to do. We don't want to write a singular worldview piece. We don't want to write a piece that just says, this is the problem, this is what you should do, A, B, C, D, E, right? We want to show you that, hey, there's a flip side opinion to this. There are people who also say these things, and some of those are pretty vivid. You should hear them. And especially we did this story about the refugee crisis in Rohingya. We worked with UNHCR about it, and in the last segment of that, we also showed why there are many ASEAN states who haven't signed certain treaties, haven't signed certain conventions, and they have their reasons why. And that's something that needs to be looked at as well, as horrifying as that may be for many people as well. And that's the thing that I think people sometimes forget to do when they're in the activist space, right? Because you care about something so much, and you
Right.
love something so intensely that you forget that maybe people don't share that same love. Yeah.
Right. So before I get to Xiao and Kai Seng, so for anyone who I can open it up to the floor now as well. If you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself. That would be the preference. But if not, you can just type your questions as well. Because if you unmute yourself, then you can go back and forth. And it doesn't have to be a question. It could be an opinion or a disagreement that you have with anything that was said earlier, and that's fine as well. We welcome a robust discussion. Okay, so I think Peng mentioned something about consensus building versus efficiency, right? And I really like that point, because if you want to be you want something to be the most efficient, then it would be a dictatorship, right? That's the most efficient, right? But building communities requires uh, a sense of ownership and a sense of belonging. And sometimes you let people, sometimes you even take on ideas which are not the best ideas, just to give that person a sense of community, right? I'm sure all of you have done this as leaders in your respective organizations, right?
Mm.
Yeah. So Kai Seng, you wanted to say anything?
Yeah, I think this this idea is like, yeah, taking time to build consensus, and maybe that, being not efficient. Yeah, at least in my mind I was like, oh, is that a narrative maybe to consider dismantling? Like, is that something to not to dismantle and not melt? But
Right.
I think the answer to me depends on your concept of time. Ironically lah, which is, where is your time frame? Is your time frame by tomorrow? Is your time frame by next month? Is your time frame in 10 years? Is the time frame the next generation? Is the time frame actually I want 10,000 years? And there is an organization, a community that's called the Long Now, LONGNOW, that is looking at building a 10,000-year clock and thinking really, really long term. And I think that really, yeah. So I think your concept of time really then matters in terms of what kind of stance you want to take on this. Yeah.
Why would people be incentivized to think about the long run? Why wouldn't people want to think about what they can do in the next couple of years, and then you can see the fruits of your labor, right? And then you feel satisfied, right? If you're going to plan for something 50 years down the road and you are not going to see it also, right? Then what's in it for you as a person, as a community builder, I suppose?
That's a great question. And I think maybe that's also, what community do you tag yourself, like Basil said, right? I tag myself as part of the human community
Right,
and
right,
part
right,
of
right,
the earth community,
right,
together with animals and plants and geography.
right.
So, and I think when I tag myself in that timeline, then yeah, I guess I can hold a longer time
Right, right.
frame.
Thank
Yeah.
you, thank you.
Mm.
Shao, you wanted to add? Yeah.
Wow, like just like I was just thinking about how, as an activist or just a person who wants to change something in this world, I do need those two skill sets, right? Power, I need that skill of power, which is to define the boundary and to set the boundary. And I also need the skill of love, which is to open the boundary. And when I was like processing, like when you pose that question of why would anyone like basically give a damn about people
Right.
like 10,000 like generations down, right? The only thing that will make me open up my boundary to even take in the impact on people further down is love. Because love opens that boundary. If I'm all about power, I just like, that's it. I
Right.
don't need to do anything beyond this, right? And and my mind is still like back to when Basil was talking about the Ukrainian guy, right? And how, because he said, I am here, that like opened up Basil. I was like, whoa, now I love Ukraine too. Take me, and it makes me see like it's so difficult to like actually unravel both, because that guy's stand, and what it means to take a stand is to stand in your power and say, I am here, are you? It is a power stand, right? But when you watch someone make that powerful stand for something or someone they love, sometimes that alone can also make you open up your boundary and say, I'm in, take me. I will go Ukraine. Yeah. So it's like, whoa, like just all the stuff you guys are saying. It's like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing so far. So we would really like to hear from you guys. So there's about half an hour. So if you guys have any questions or any comments, feel free to type them in or just unmute yourself. So one of the things, and maybe Chris, you can help me monitor if there are raised hands or anything. So one of the things that I always think about, right, as a student of politics, right, I always think about power and how power never gives itself up willingly, right? Power needs to be taken from. Very rarely in the history of humanity have people given up their power willingly. Even those instances, right, it's only because usually a recognition, right, that if I do not give this amount of power up, I would lose even more, right? And this is cross-cultural, cross-political system, even in marriages or whatever it is. This happens all the time, right? Power doesn't give itself up willingly.
You would do it out of love.
Yes, yes, exactly. So that's my point, right? So how do we, as I was listening to you, right? I do not disagree with anything that you said, but how do we instill that love in our communities?
Mm.
Yeah.
You know, I've been thinking about that because love is the thing that we know we really want and need, but it also feels so almost gross to talk about it in a professional setting, let alone a political setting. Like, can you imagine you run a campaign like, "Hi, elect me, I stand for love." Then everybody's like, "Ew, gross. Love will never take Singapore far, people."
Right, right,
You know?
right.
But
right.
it will. But it will. But people are so unconvinced, and I'm realizing how much we need to translate love into language that power understands. You
Right,
know, it cannot sound wishy-washy. So
right,
the definition of love that I've been really loving is love just means the desire to unite what is separated. It means, do you care about those things which are not you, that are separated from you, that are different from you? If you do anything that tries to bring those in, then you are doing something out of love, whether you feel soft or not, or whether you look soft or not. As long as you're uniting what is separated, you are doing things out of love. Yeah, so that's one definition I really have been loving, because it doesn't sound soft. It's pretty
right,
tough work.
right. I really like that line as well. We need to translate love into a language that power understands, right? That's really a powerful line. So we have a couple of questions. Well, Amanda's first. So power is associated with control because it is instills fear in some form. The grief of free will is in a form of expression of love. So can love thrive in the presence of power? I think probably Shao answered that as just now. So Vivian, you want to unmute yourself and ask your two questions?
Yeah, hello.
Hi,
Uh,
hi.
Hi, can you hear me? And also, is
Yes.
the music in the background too loud?
No, no music,
I'm in
and
a
we can
bar.
hear you. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great. Okay, thanks so much for sharing your views. I think the conversation has been really inspiring. So I work in MCCY, and I also have a very strong personal interest around what it means to be a whole individual and a whole community. So I wanted to share some thoughts I have and also ask two questions. So the thoughts I have follow on from what Kai-Sing you mentioned earlier, which is when you said um, being brokenness is part of the whole. And I actually, in my view, I would go further to say that sometimes brokenness can be a prerequisite for true wholeness. I don't know if that resonates with any of you, but for me, I feel like being self-aware of our brokenness is what allows us to appreciate the hard work that is needed to build wholeness. So I have recognized the brokenness in me, and it's only through doing a lot of personal development work which allowed me to really understand the importance of self-work in building better relationships and better communities. So in MCCY, our mandate is to build societal cohesion, which I guess you can define as building whole communities. And I really have very strong hopes and aspirations to do that. We can do a lot more on this because we continue to see our differences, like our racial and religious divides, as fault lines that could lead to societal conflict. We continue to see certain segments of our society, like persons with mental health conditions, disabled people, low-income workers. These segments continue to face stigma, and they continue to feel like second-class citizens, which I feel can constrain our national narrative of inclusivity. So the two questions that I have is, I wanted to bring in the role of government here since I work in MCCY, which is, in your view, what more can government do to partner organizations like yourselves to build societal cohesion? Because I really do believe we are working on the same problem statements. And when we talk about power, how can we better empower people working to make positive change on the ground? So that's one question. The second question that I have is related to what I mentioned about personal development. How can we better develop fundamental human skills that we need among all of us to build whole communities? Because in doing all the self-work that I mentioned, I really believe that it is our level of personal development that can determine our ability to engage constructively with others and to build healthy relationships, and that human transformation can make societal transformation possible. So as we talk about building whole communities, we can't lose that sight of the need to build whole individuals first. I think you guys talked about that too. And when I think about how we want to build, how we can bring people together to talk across differences, without the ability to have empathy, to have humility, to have curiosity, to have courage to talk across our differences. And we say these things, but it's actually very difficult to practice, when, emotions run high. All these things are necessary to have progress in difficult conversations. So how can we, in your view, do better in building these skills among our citizens? So for example, just things like self-awareness and mindfulness, these are things that are critical in allowing you to talk to people who are different to you, because you need to be conscious of your own cognitive biases. You need to be open and present with someone who is different to you, which is, again, it's actually very difficult to do. It can be difficult to do in practice.
Right.
Yeah, so those are the two questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot, Vivian. I think it's a special forum today, so I'm getting quotable quotes not just from the speakers but from the audience as well, right? So, brokenness is a prerequisite of our wholeness, right? And that's something for us to chew on. So, Vivian asked two questions, right? So, what more can the government do? I'm gonna use my moderator privilege to rephrase her question, right? Should government do anything in regard to your organizations? Do we need the involvement of the government all the time in the work that you do, right? So so that's the first question. And the second one is, how do we essentially build whole individuals, right, with self-awareness, empathy, and humility, right? Well, those are big questions. Yeah. So Ping, you want to go? Oh, Shao, you are unmuted. So you go
No,
first, then
I'm
Kai
going
Sing.
to say I wish with all my heart that the answer to those two questions came together. That one of the most beautiful things the government can do is to recognize that that second question matters. And whoever's working in government to fight for that perspective, because that would lead to so many changes in policies at so many different levels, right? And to also work with the people on the ground, holding that perspective for us as well. I think that would be a beautiful act of leadership. That's all I want, to bring my kid to school and to trust that, let's say, MOE says like, you know what? It's just as important that your kids learn to be whole, emotionally healthy human beings as it is to pass things here every 2 weeks. It's that important. In fact, I'll test them on their emotional awareness. Then I'll be like, wow, they're taking it that seriously. Okay. So that there's so many things. And I get it, so I'm not saying like, okay, government, please do that. It's not a job for government to do alone. But if government holds that structural perspective, that this is a boundary we're going to hold here, and we want you to step up to the plate, citizens, we will be like, whoa, hello, Ukraine, we're in with you. Yeah, so that's what I would love. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Ping, then Kai Sing. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I was just thinking, you know, about Xiao's response, and yeah, I was thinking that, for government, like Singapore as a society, I think because I don't want to say the government's at fault, but because a lot of standards are set at the top, right? And it's always about, results. We are a results-driven society, and people also always say that Singapore is essentially a very big corporation, right? It's all about, outcomes, targets, and what do we achieve year on year. And there's this expectation that we must do better than the year before. We must do better than 2 years ago. We cannot have a bad year where maybe we regressed or we didn't do as well. And that's very much the narrative in Singapore. And I was thinking maybe, we shouldn't be such a results-driven society. And then I was thinking also, okay, no, that's not an answer that's acceptable to the government, right? You cannot say throw away all your, targets and your goals. And then I think, yeah, perhaps the answer is in looking for new metrics, remeasuring what we think is important, right? And then that ties into what Xiao said, right? instead of testing how good you are with your things here and your spelling and your grades, maybe we need to have a metric. I mean, I'm not saying that we should go as far to then say like we should, do this toxic thing where like we help students ace their mental health, and like make sure you have like perfect score, that sort of thing. That's, I mean, I hope they don't go there. um, that would be terrifying, right? But I think it's about changing what we measure as important, right? And changing what we value as a whole in society, and then again also recognizing that that takes time. And I think coming back to Walid's rephrased question of do we think it's necessary to involve the government? I mean, personally for me, definitely. Like a lot of the causes that we support, it's all at the the CTA that we always have at the end of our story is always like you should talk to your elected representatives, you should talk to your government officials.
Right.
And I think in an organization and in a country, I think people often willingly give up the power that they have, and they always say things like, I talk for what? Like they won't change for what? Like
Correct.
they have this bad narrative in their head. But I think that everyone has a responsibility in your government and or in your organization or in your country. If you have a toxic boss and you kind of just be upset at it and don't do anything about it, then you're just as guilty in facilitating that behavior, right?
Absolutely.
And I feel that as citizens we have a responsibility to speak up and share what we say, of course responsibility and and politely and respectfully sometimes, and the government also needs to do its part to hear lah.
So being said respectfully sometimes only. Sometimes there is a there is a place for being disrespectful. So Kaiseng, you wanted to say?
I think building on Ping's point, I think it's not just a government thing, same as Shaw. I think citizens and people do need to play a part. My own sensing, it's easy as a citizen to blame and point fingers, especially when the government doesn't do well in certain things. It's easy to say, "Nah, you see lah." And I think it's like I guess the government. I see the government as also a community, right, of like X amount of civil and public servants. But the citizens in Singapore is a much larger number, so there are more fingers to point lah. At a smaller
it's a terrible
community,
visual.
and I feel like maybe shifting from a language of complaint to a language of commitment and what better say activation. So that we are two communities activating together, would really be lovely. Vivian, I really appreciate the second question and the quote. It reminds me of Leonard Cohen's Anthem. It's a song, and in the line, there's a very powerful line around, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. And it's a beautiful song, I think, that really leans towards that.
Right. So thank you. I think Ping and Kaising, I mean the sum of your answers, yes, we should hold the government, any government, to high standards, but we must also hold citizens to some standards, right? And if there's no demand, there won't be supply, right? Right?
Oh gosh.
Right. So and I think we really must think about this. And I think what Ping said, I think it hits the nail on the head. Like a lot of people just underestimate the power that people have, right? And I also, the one of the things that I think all of us agree that we have dropped the ball on is how our foreign workers are treated, right? And it's very easy to point the finger at the government, but there's a reason why that hasn't been the issue hasn't been solved, is because people didn't care about it, right? So it is as much on the government as it is on everyone else, I think. And I think that's the sum of what Kai Sing and Peng said. I mean, I'm just using an example to illustrate what they've said as well. Basil, you wanted to say? Because I'm thinking in your field especially, is more government intervention useful or less? Because I'm thinking in interfaith, right? That's where you don't need a minister at every interfaith event, right? You don't need you don't need MPs to be involved. In fact, in that kind of robust, where you maybe need more robust exchanges, right? The non-intervention of the government is perhaps better.
I have to be honest. I've been connected to this field for the last 12 years now. And I honestly have no idea whether it's more government intervention or less government intervention that will help. But one thing that I can know that I have observed myself that seems to apply was actually the second part of Xiaoyin's answer, which was basically that human development, the growth of the individual, right? Whether we look at it as self-improvement or healing our wounds or maintaining our daily life in as fulfilling a way as possible, right? So a way in which the individual is growing. I refer to this as the self-awareness, right? But self-awareness requires other awareness. Just like Vivian, when you were talking about how brokenness and the connection to, what was it? The connection to healing, or was it something like that? But yeah, so anyway, I'm connecting this like that awareness of the self comes in comparison to the awareness of the other. And Walid, you mentioned this thing about foreign workers, right? So I had the enormous privilege in my training to actually live as a migrant worker, a construction migrant worker in a construction site, somewhere in the middle of Woodlands when they were building this HDB block. So I was living there and working as a typical migrant worker for about 1 month. Right. Wow. So I ate there, I slept there, I worked with them, I cleaned the toilets, the rubbish bins, everything like that, right? And basically I'm living inside the workers' quarters in sort of like a janitor's closet with the actual Bangladeshi janitor. So the Bangladeshi janitor, he's sort of like the lowest of the low in the whole workers' quarters, right? And then I'm like his assistant, right? So we slept in this bunk bed, this double-decker bed, and every morning we took out our brooms and mop and went to clean up the construction site, clean the toilets, everything, right? But, that guy was also a poet, right? So at night, he would stay up and he would write Bengali poetry. And I didn't realize this. Singapore actually has a Bengali newspaper. And as a migrant worker in Singapore, right, he's only been here maybe 2 years or so at that time. He actually submitted his poem to that Bengali newspaper and he won, first prize, right? So it's like, there's so much about the other that we may not be aware of. And so when I was up late at night and I was writing my own journal after work, he was like, "Oh, brother, you also write? Me too," and he started showing me his poetry, right? So the reason I'm sharing this is that maybe that self-awareness, that human growth comes with exposure to the other, exposure to diversity, because that's how, and maybe that's that essential dynamic within a community, right? It's the in-group, out-group, that they have to be there. They both have to be there. And in being exposed to the other, I find myself, I discover myself, and that identity of one single individual starts to grow, and that somehow may contribute to the rest of the community I'm connected to at that moment or that phase of life.
Thank you so much, Rizal. I hope your poems were as good as his.
Mine were prose, journal entries. His was beautiful.
All right. Okay, so Arun has a question. Arun, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, yeah. First of all, I want to thank all of y'all for really profound sharings. And I think the thing that I keep coming back to as I hear all the different points that that y'all been sharing is each of us as individuals as well as collectives, right, need to be willing to expose ourselves to discomfort. Because when we have all these conversations about in-group, out-group, us and them and others, right? We can't deny that for a lot of people, there can be varying degrees of discomfort. And that is something that, in my view, society, especially Singaporean society, is not very well used to and not very well equipped to handle or deal with. I think recently, was it last year or something, there was an article that said that, I think on Today, that said that Singapore society is ill-equipped to handle some of these conversations. So I think this also touches a little bit about what Vivian was talking about, capacity building on a societal level. Whose responsibility is it, and to what degree the varying communities are responsible for it, whether it's the government, whether it's the individual, whether it's communities. And I wonder what all of y'all thought about that. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Arun. So if I may build on what Arun said and the final part of what Basil said, right? So about the exposure, right? I do find, I don't know whether this is true, but I do find what Arun says is generally true of all strata of Singaporeans, but also increasingly I find it amongst younger Singaporeans more and more. So being wanting to be shielded from discomfort and even ideas which may be a little bit discomforting, and even people who disagree with us, we do not really want to be exposed to that, and maybe it's a function of social media as well, right? Because of the algorithms, we are all in our bubbles, right? So I do find that that is a problem, because the less we are exposed to others, right, as Basil said, right? And Basil is talking about a specific situation where there is a class and local foreigner, and then there's a class dimension, but we can extend it even to just different ideas, right? People with people who think about the world differently from us, and if we are uncomfortable with some of them, then that's not really a good situation, right, for us to build whole community. So Paying, am I generalizing younger people? Am I misgeneralizing?
Yeah. Quite a number of thoughts went through my mind when you said that. And yeah, I don't want to like so-called speak for my generation, because I think, like I don't think it. I mean, to me also sometimes I'm like, is it Gen Z? And also, I also don't understand.
Right.
Like TikTok and all that. I'm not on the TikTok train, so I don't quite figure it out too. But I think, and I'm coming back to Vivian's question again, and I think when she said, how do you work on yourself? How do you build that self-awareness and care for, say, the person next to you who's a stranger? I was just thinking that, sometimes the people who go through the deepest pain also come up with the greatest empathy. And I was thinking about this experience that I had in Cambodia, which obviously we all know has gone through a very traumatic event as a whole country, right? Where every other person knows, everyone has lost someone they love. It's a fact. It's not like I know somebody, like everyone has lost somebody they love. And but I was on this tuk-tuk, and the roads were dusty, and I was trying to shield my face with a scarf, and the tuk-tuk driver pulled up by a shop, went into the shop and bought me a face mask. And I was just thinking, he had absolutely no need to do that for me. So what drives an individual to do that, right? And I think to some extent, I'm not a political scientist, and I don't know why, maybe the Cambodians as a society are very caring for each other. But I was thinking, perhaps it's this, deep trauma that they all share, this understanding that they all share, that has also, sort of come up with this, an empathy for the, for the other. And I think that's, coming back to your question of like younger generation, I think maybe because it's a default of being young, right? There is less exposure to this in life. And in Singapore, I think we always like, sometimes we make jokes that, the scholars, they go through the education system so smooth sailingly. But if you throw them in a problem that is not something that they've encountered before, they completely break down. They don't know how to resolve it. They don't know how to function in the real world, right? And I think we have these comments because we know that they haven't had that setback. They haven't experienced that pain of all that discomfort. And I think, it's not, and every generation, we always say the younger generation, it's not new.
It's true.
It's
true. Yeah.
always you are young, like you don't understand. I think there's a degree of, because maybe they have not experienced as much. I don't want to say that and then young people are like, of course you say that lah, like, this whole like you've had more salt than you've had
Right,
more
right,
salt
right.
than I have rice or
Oh, yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. But I think to some degree it is true. Yeah, and going through that discomfort, that painful experience also creates emotional maturity. Yeah.
Right. So there is a comment from Vivian. She has had the same thought that it is our experience with pain and struggle that allows us to do the work and teach others on how to overcome this. I think for sure, and I think we are almost towards the end already. So we are at the end. So I'll ask everyone just to share some final thoughts. But before that, I wanted to just set also maybe some personal experience, right? Because my son is now in primary one, I think. Shao around the same age, right?
Mine's
So
primary
yeah,
2 this year.
primary two, yeah. So around the same age, and I'm also struggling with a lot of things, right? So on
Mhm.
one hand, I don't want to shield him from every single difficulty, right? Being teased is part of growing up, for instance, right? And it's primary school is rough. He's gonna be teased for a lot of things, and it also builds capacity building, right? So on one hand, I don't want that. On the other, I also know that extreme bullying can be extremely traumatic for the rest of the. So when does the intervention come, right? Why am I saying this, right? I'm saying this, right? Also in response to how government should treat the NGO sector or this sectors that help build whole communities. That's one area I'm saying. What is the level of intervention? You don't want too much, you don't want too little. Where exactly is the sweet spot? I don't know whether that sweet spot can be easily discerned. And secondly, as individuals, what is the level of discomfort that we are going to allow as a society, right? I do feel that that is the next big question that we will have to discuss and it's manifested in certain things, like for instance trigger warnings, and what is the level of trigger warnings that we're going to have for what issues, because if we're going to say somebody is going to be triggered by something, then almost everyone is going to be triggered by something else as well, right? So I think it's going to manifest itself. I do not have the answers to these questions. I'm just putting it. I think I'm struggling with it, and I don't know the answer. But mine is just an individual. I only have one that I'm dealing with now. But I think as a society, we have to ask all those big questions, right? If we are really interested in nurturing whole communities. So I'll just let everyone speak, maybe in reverse order. Just now I started with Shao, right? So I'll end with Shao today. Basil, you want to go first? Oh, sorry, Paying. You want to go first? Final thoughts. Yeah.
Wow, there's a lot of sharing today, and I think probably the best thing that can happen now is we are leaving this conversation with more questions than we have answers, right? Because it's thinking about what do we have to do next, and how can we, some of the great ideas that have been shared here, like how, again, it comes back to my idea of like what I said about, as an individual you have responsibility and you have power. Even if you're living in a very oppressed society, you have power, and you shouldn't give that up easily. And as an individual, what can I do to, first of all, in my organization or the people around me, and then hopefully, to pay it forward to the next person. So I have more, yeah, my closing remarks, I guess, is I have more questions than answers in relation to what you shared. And I mean, I don't have the answers of like how can we do this, but yeah, like, hoping to find a way to figure it out.
Right. Okay. So there's just a comment here that I feel like I should address. So the narrative of Ukraine is different from other narratives. I think not that that's an unfair question, but I think we must also uh, understand that sometimes there is a time for what about ism, and there isn't a time for that, because you can acknowledge a lot of things at the same time. You can acknowledge that don't forget, during the invasion of Iraq, there were millions of people on the streets of London who were protesting it. British people who were people in America were. I mean, Bernie Sanders is still bringing that up, right? So I don't think whether it's fair to raise that, and I also think that because we are going through it now, it's very relevant and it's very fair for all of us to shed a tear or two and to stand in solidarity with anyone who's facing that, and Ukraine is facing that. So I don't think it's unfair for us to do that. Yeah, Basil?
I guess I'll end on 2 points. One is observation, and one is a bit more towards healing, right? With the observation aspect, I just encourage people to, notice the gaps, right? Notice what's missing, whether it's in yourself as an individual, right? Whether it's mental, it's physical, right? It could be health, right? Or whether it's about your community, right? The community that you seem to be most affiliated with, or several of them, right? What's missing there? And finally, in society as a whole, right? Noticing those gaps, right? You don't have to go all out and fight, for those gaps to be filled, but like start asking yourself the question, like, why are those gaps there, right? So and just figure out, what's the reason, what's the rationale, rather than a very aggressive form of immediately trying to blast everything at it and fill it up straight away, right? Figure out what purpose it may have served, when it was created a long time ago, right? Does that purpose still work? Is it still being served? So that's one. The second thing may be both personal but community-based as well. And it's connected to what some people have already said just now, right? There's a term that I keep hearing about recently, anti-fragile. It was first being used on bones, right? There's certain bones in your body whenever they get knocked, whenever they go through a bit of pain, they actually become stronger, right? And maybe that's that sense of, hey, if I start noticing the gaps, the weaknesses, the issues, the challenges, right? There is an aspect of community where, we might start to discover that form of healing. And maybe it takes us from, moving in group to out group, in group to out group, in group to out group. And in that diversity of the groups that we are exposed to, the other that we are exposed to, we might discover, right, things that actually naturally fill up those gaps and make us anti-fragile. Just like that term I started off with, a versatile diversity, right? So like Pei Ying said, let us take the pain, let's change the narrative around the pain and look at that pain as potential for healing, potential for improving ourselves.
Thank you, Basil. Kai Sing?
Wow. Okay. I think Arun makes a really good point around discomfort, and I think a lot of the issues we have now is because we don't pay attention to discomfort. Just like what Basil says, like diversity by default, I think it's also discomfort by default, because everybody holds different boundaries, and that makes all of us uncomfortable all the time. But we constantly distract ourselves from the discomfort by doing other things, by social media, by and I sometimes feel maybe communitying is also distracting in a way that, oh yeah, no, this is not a community for me. Let me go and find another one or do something else. And I don't know whether that's also not looking at the discomfort of, oh, why is this really uncomfortable for me, and just sitting with it. And I don't think it's just sitting with it and just reflecting, because I do think we need to take action, but there's the distraction, I think, that's maybe not recognizing the brokenness. It's la 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 la, okay, there's brokenness, and then I move. That may be something that's interesting for me, I think, to think about. So thank you so much, everyone.
That's throwing a spanner right at the end, like communitying is also a distraction. That's such a huge thing. Yeah, but I do want to consider that seriously as well. Thank you, Kai Seng. Shao, final word.
I think if we want to play any part in healing the systems or the people that we care about, we have to have the humility and the honesty to begin with healing in ourselves. And it's always going to be a progressive piece of work. But I think healing ourselves means having the courage to search for the parts within ourselves that we don't particularly like, that make us uncomfortable. There's a part of us that we want to deny. It's the outgroup in us, it's the other in us, it's the fragmentation in us that we just, and the more uncomfortable we are with admitting that there is a part of me that is poor, that is forgotten, that is ugly, that is not very nice and all that, right? If we can get comfortable with these uncomfortable parts of us, I think that translates to the ability to be empathetic and to be aware of what makes us uncomfortable outside, right? I have to be able to see that. And I think when you do that, then the activist, advocate, whatever you want to call yourself, right? You are able to dial down on the self-righteousness a bit.
Right.
That's the only cure for self-righteousness, where we have the humility to say, you know what,
Right.
like, I'm not completely right myself. I'm not all right, but I am also paradoxically all right enough to take a stand.
Right.
Yeah. So that's my only invitation for anyone who wants to be a part of any change. Like, it really begins with the honesty and the humility to examine what parts of me are not okay, and yet I am okay enough to do something about it. And that's a difficult paradox to bring together.
Thank you so much, Shao. That is really a beautiful way to end this forum. Intellectual humility. I mean that's a good reminder for myself. I think for everybody else, that is the first thing we must start with: intellectual humility. So thank you, everyone. I think hopefully we got through that without saying anything that will make us get cancelled. Hopefully. On else, thank you to the panelists and thank you to everyone else. I thoroughly enjoyed this session. A bit high level, but I really enjoyed it.